Hey everybody, this is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Robocop the remake. Now, when this project was first announced, my feelings were initially very negative. I love the original Robocop film, and even though I think it holds up really well today, so much of its greatness is rooted within its 80s-ness. What I mean is, there were certain things you'd see back then that you cannot see now. Take its excessive violence, for example. It's incredibly gritty and brutal, but it's also a little bit cheesy and over the top, so it's never too mean-spirited, while at the same time, it never loses its edge. Furthermore, the satire, which is in many ways what made that film memorable, was also very 80s. And even though I think most viewers could still get it, it was at its most relevant back then. And so I figured if they remade it, it would either be just a rehash of the original, which once again, you can't take what worked in the 80s and that won't necessarily work now, or it would just be a dumbed down version of the original. So, and you know, there's always the chance that it would defy those expectations, that it would actually create a great modern day film that's relevant for the times as of now. Stumbled on my words a little bit there. Usually that doesn't happen, unfortunately. But then the more I thought about it, the more hopeful I became. I really do want the RoboCop franchise to continue in some capacity, and unfortunately, the previous continuity sort of ran itself into the ground. I think the first film is great. The second film is good. It brings back a lot of what I liked about the first RoboCop, but it never really compares to it. And then the third film just sucked. And then I hear the TV show is just as bad, if not worse. So I haven't seen that one. But yeah, so it seemed like for a while that RoboCop was dead, and unfortunately remaking it would be the only way to keep his legacy alive. But when I really started to warm up to this movie was when the director was announced. Now, I don't remember his name. Let me see if I have it. Jose Padilla? I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly. He's primarily known for making the Elite Squad movies. Now, the first Elite Squad was regarded as great, but when I saw it, I thought it was good but a little overrated. Now, Elite Squad 2 is often considered to be superior to the first film, and I thought that was just as great as everybody said. I loved that movie, and I thought he was a very bold and daring choice on the studio's part, because he's not a very marketable name, but at the same time, if they're bringing this guy on board, they must really want to make a great experience. So I was suddenly looking forward to this movie. But then my feelings began to sour again when it started to come out that it looked like the studio was sort of hijacking the project from the director. He was complaining. He still was hopeful. Like he said, he thought it would be a good movie, but he was surprised at how much opposition he was getting, which I think is stupid because, once again, he's not a marketable name. He doesn't have a major audience like Michael Bay or Roland Emmerich or even Steven Spielberg does. But once you hire somebody like him because you want something special, and it seemed like the studios wanted something more marketable, which once again I thought was incredibly stupid considering they already hired this guy. And then the trailer came out, and it didn't look bad, but it didn't really impress me either. And the reviews started to come in, and for the most part, everybody was lukewarm. Well, that was never going to stop me from watching the movie, so I went ahead and checked it out. And is it as okay as everybody says it is? Yes, it is thoroughly okay. It's better than mediocre, but not quite as good as good. So let's begin with the story. One thing I really liked about this movie is it takes the central concept of RoboCop and pretty much does its own thing with it. Yeah, there are some familiar story elements, but it is telling its own story, which I think is a good idea. And the story is actually pretty well done. I think it did have a nice flow to it. I've heard some people complain that the first half was really slow-paced. I disagree. It is a little leisurely paced. It's in no hurry to get itself over with, but at no point did I ever find it to be slow or boring. Yet at the same time, I never thought it was really riveting or exciting either. But I thought its best strength was the character of RoboCop. I really liked what they did with him here. Now, in terms of the actor, He's just no Peter Weller. But at the same time, I might be being unfair because, I am so used to Peter Weller in that role. It's just like, replacing Robert Englund from A Nightmare on Elm Street. It doesn't really matter how good this new guy is, it's just not the same. But I thought his acting was fine. My only problem was I felt, well, his voice is nowhere near as impressive as Peter Weller's, but also his facial features always seemed kind of soft in contrast to, his robotic body. And I don't know, it was a strange contrast that I'm not sure I liked. But his acting was good, and I do think he'll go places. It was a good start for him, considering this is the first. Well, I think he was in Safe House, but it was a minor role, so I don't really remember him. But this, I believe, is his first major role, his breakthrough role. But I liked how when he's injured or maimed, and he becomes Robocop, he's still Murphy. In the original film, he's immediately more machine than man. And even though there are signs that the original Murphy is still in there somewhere, he's acting like a machine. Whereas in this one, at first, he is acting like a normal human in a robot body. And now some people might not like that. It is just a case of which do you prefer, but I thought they did a good job there. And but over time, they had to make these various modifications that make him more robotic and much more akin to the original Robocop. And I thought that was interesting. And eventually he has to sort of refined his humanity, and I thought it was a nice character arc. They really did a good job at, I think, exploring that character. I wasn't sure what I felt about this suit. Once again, the original is so iconic, and even though this suit is good, it's just not going to stay as long within my memory. I think, honestly, if they really wanted to update it, just use the original design and then make it black, or just use the original design and keep it gray. But I just thought that was odd, considering so much of RoboCop's popularity, in my opinion, is his appearance. I mean, kids loved RoboCop, even though the first two movies were hard R. I never even saw the first two movies until I was older, but because I thought the toys were so awesome, that's the reason why I became attached to that character initially. And I just don't think this new one's going to have that same effect. I was going to say something else, but I can't remember. If I think of it, I'll come back to it. I do remember. One thing that's also interesting in terms of differences is the world and the original. Well, the original RoboCop was more about the world that RoboCop existed within and how he affects it and how it affects him. So you had a lot of like bizarre telecast sequences, stuff that doesn't really tie into the actual story, but it's, once again, the emphasis is on the world of RoboCop, not RoboCop himself. Well, this one is much more about the character of RoboCop. In fact, I thought the overall world was kind of one of the film's weak links, but since that was the focus and they did a good job with it, that was really, I think, the film's main anchor. Where I did feel the story kind of fumbled was with the wife. That's kind of something that's really difficult for me to say, though, because I thought she was kind of a weak link in the original film, too. In the original, well, actually the first two films, she's only there to emphasize that somewhere deep down Murphy exists. But I thought it was a weak link because there's never any real payoff to that subplot, and it just kind of feels like a tacked-on subplot in the long run. Whereas here, she is more prominent. She does play a bigger role within the story, and I like that, but at the same time, it is a rather standard role. They could have done better with that, even though, once again, I respect that they actually tried something different with her. I also felt the villains were kind of weak. There are three primary villains and a lot of sub-villains, but all of their subplots are resolved very anticlimactically. And in a lot of cases, I didn't really buy them as the villain. There's the one character who is responsible for Murphy's death, and in the original film he was pretty much the main villain, even though he wasn't the final villain, and I thought that character did fine. He could have been interesting, but he's also the least important of the three big villains, and he's the first one whose subplot is resolved, and that's all it's treated as. Even though this is the guy who killed Murphy and in a sense is responsible for RoboCop, he is pretty much just a minor subplot. And same with the crooked cops and stuff like that. I think they needed to emphasize them more and give them better endings than what we got. It was just, once again, too anticlimactic. And then there's another guy who, at first, he's actually kind of likable, and when he's hostile towards Murphy, you understand why, but then for absolutely no reason during the second half, they decide to make this guy more villainous, and I thought that was pretty weak. I didn't buy that. And the worst offender has to be, though, Michael Keaton's character, who's the corporate guy, and even though he's shown to be kind of ruthless and corrupt in certain areas, he's just, a typical businessman whose some of his practices aren't very honest. But during the final act, he becomes a straight up villain. I just didn't buy that either. And once above everything, though, I just didn't like how any of those characters were resolved. So that's really all I have to say about the story. There is more substance, intelligence, and heart in this film than you'd have in the majority of blockbuster flicks, but it never really excels in any regard. Even the character arc with Robocop, I don't think I'm going to remember this movie for very long. Say what you will about the original, but it still is within my head, even though it's been like a year or so when I've seen it, since I've seen it, and I remember that movie more clearly than this one, which I just watched a few days ago. Now, in terms of the action, it was very okay, like the rest of the movie. Relatively simple gunfights. I thought that it was framed pretty well and it was edited pretty well, but it never really jumped up at me. It never was amazing. I thought the special effects were really good, even though it does use some CGI. It seems like the filmmakers favored practical effects, and when they used CGI, I thought it was pretty well integrated into the film to where it never stood out as CGI. But nothing about it, like I said, was especially amazing. I feel it really needed to be more violent, because when you look at the original film, the action sequences weren't amazing there either, but because they were so gritty and there were so many blood squibs and people were dying in these crazy over-the-top ways, that really made up for it. Whereas here it's just PG-13 violence, except they don't really try to make up for that in terms of giving us stylized action sequences. So I wish they would have done that better. One thing, though, it could have been justified if all Robocop used was the stun gun, because when you think about it, back then people weren't as sensitive when it came to police brutality. It was certainly there, but I could buy that kind of stuff happening in the 80s, whereas with now we are much more sensitive about that kind of stuff. If a cop punches somebody, they can get in trouble. So I think it actually makes sense that he'd use a stun gun of some sort, but it seemed like that was inconsistent. Sometimes he'd use it, other times not. If they really wanted to go all out with the PG-13 rating, they probably should have just justified it by explaining that Robocop can't kill people, and and throughout the film, maybe he only does end up killing a few characters when he has to. So yeah, that's all I have to say in regards to the action sequences. I also felt that Detroit needed to be more ugly. Now, in the original film, the setting was very over the top. It was a stereotypical crime-ridden town. It was sleazy, it was murky, it was the type of place you'd hate to live in, and it made a perfect scenario for Robocop to get involved in. Here, Detroit looks oddly nice and clean and happy, and considering that they're emphasizing how these robots could keep people safe. That it would have made more sense to have it more murky and gross, like even like Elysium, but they didn't. So I thought that was kind of a missed opportunity. But as a whole, the film was okay. If you want to see it, go ahead and see it, and if you don't want to see it, then don't see it. I'd say it's at least worth a rental, but if you want to watch it in theaters, that's up to you. It's not good enough to really change your mind, nor is it bad enough to really change your mind as well. So that is all I have to say. I did not do a written review, but I didn't even bring up my written review list. Sorry. I did do written reviews of The Reef, VHS 2, and something else. So if you want to read those reviews, please check them out. I am doing an Amazon sale. I'm getting rid of a lot of books and movies and games and I put like the first 25 items on my website, so please check out that list. And if you see anything you like, please buy it. I'll do an official video on that probably tomorrow or the next day. And yes, Critiquing the Critics is coming soon. Expect to hear about that next week. Next week is going to be a very important week for Critiquing the Critics. So I'll see you guys then. And of course, follow me on Twitter. I did get a Facebook account, so you might as well follow me there too. And I'll stop wasting your time now, and I'll see you guys later.